Emma arrived at her mother's apartment with 2 children, 3 suitcases, and the absolute certainty that she had nowhere else to go. What she found when the door opened was not her mother. It was a stranger in a bathrobe, the smell of someone else's cooking, and a lock that had been changed months before anyone thought to tell her. That was the first shock. The second came 40 minutes later, when her mother finally picked up the phone, and her voice was not confused or apologetic, but flat and rehearsed, the voice of someone who had been waiting for this exact call and had prepared exactly what to say. I need to go back to the beginning, because the beginning is the only way to make the end make any sense at all. And even then, I'm not entirely sure it does. My name is Emma. I was 31 years old, and I had spent the previous 8 months believing that the worst thing that had happened to me was my divorce. I had been wrong about that, the way you are sometimes wrong about which thing is the wound and which thing is just the bruise over it. The divorce from a man named Paul, who turned out to be the kind of person who grows more honest about what he is only after the papers are signed, had been devastating in the way that all divorces are devastating. The sudden geography of a life you thought you knew, rearranged overnight. The bed too wide, the grocery list too short, the children's faces at the dinner table carrying questions they didn't yet have the language for. Lily was 6, Noah was 4. They understood that Daddy didn't live with us anymore, and they had adjusted to this the way children adjust to things. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but with the extraordinary resilience of small people who have not yet learned to catastrophize. I was trying to learn from them. The plan had been simple, the way plans always seem simple in the moment before they collapse. Paul and I had sold the house, our house, the one with the yellow kitchen and the porch swing and the garden I had planted in the first year of our marriage, when I still believed that permanence was something you could put into the ground and water, and split the proceeds. My share was enough for a deposit somewhere, but not enough for a deposit somewhere good, not in the city, not in a school district I needed for Lily. My mother, whose name was Carol, had a 3-bedroom apartment in a quiet building 20 minutes from Lily's school and 8 minutes from the pediatric clinic where Noah had his monthly checkups. She had lived there for 11 years. She had raised me, largely, in an apartment 2 floors down in the same building. She knew the super by name. She fed pigeons on the balcony on Sunday mornings and called it meditation. The apartment was hers, fully paid, no mortgage, the only thing of real value that she owned. She had offered. That was the part I kept coming back to in the months that followed, the part that made everything else so much harder to process. She had offered. In April, over the phone, she had said, "Come stay with me for a while, Emma, just until you find something. There's plenty of room. The children can share the big room. It'll be nice to have the noise." And I had said, "Thank you, Mom. I might take you up on that." And she had said, "Please do." Those were the words she used. Please do. I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in October. The drive had taken 4 hours, which was 2 hours longer than it should have taken, because we stopped twice for Noah's ear, which had been bothering him since the weekend, and once because Lily dropped her water bottle and it rolled under the seat, and she cried about it with the particular operatic intensity of a 6-year-old who has been in a car too long. By the time we pulled into the parking lot of my mother's building, I was tired in the bone-deep way that single parents become tired. Not just from the day, but from the accumulated weight of all the days before it, each one slightly heavier than the last. But I was also, underneath the tiredness, genuinely relieved. I had told myself all the way there, it's going to be okay. You're not starting over, you're just pausing. Mom will make tea, and the kids will sleep in the big room, and in the morning, everything will look manageable. I had 3 suitcases, 2 children, and a box of Lily's books. I could not carry all of it at once, so I left the box in the car and took Lily by one hand and Noah by the other, and we took the elevator to the 4th floor, and I knocked on the door of apartment 4C because I didn't have a key yet, and my mother hadn't mentioned leaving one. The door opened. The person who opened it was a woman I had never seen before in my life. She was perhaps 60, with dyed dark hair and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, and she was wearing a bathrobe that was clearly her own, the familiar, slightly shabby kind that you only wear at home. And she looked at me with the particular expression of someone whose evening has been interrupted by an unexpected knock. Behind her, I could see into the apartment. The layout was right, my mother's layout, the hallway leading left to the kitchen and right to the living room. But everything else was wrong. The furniture was different. The smell was different. Garlic and something herbal, not my mother's Chanel No. 5 and the faint vanilla of her beeswax candles. On the wall where my mother had always hung a large framed print of a Klimt painting, there was a landscape I didn't recognize. I said, "I'm sorry, I think I have the wrong floor." But even as I said it, I could see the number on the door, 4C. I had the right floor. I had the right number. I had the wrong everything else. The woman looked at me with a kind of cautious sympathy, the kind you give to someone who is clearly distressed in a way that is not yet your problem, but might become it. She said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I'm looking for Carol Marsh. She lives here. She's lived here for 11 years. The woman's expression shifted slightly, something tightening behind the eyes, and she said, "I've been here since August. I'm sorry, I don't know anyone by that name." I stood in the hallway of my mother's building, in the fourth-floor corridor with its particular smell of old carpet and radiator heat and the faint echo of someone's television 2 doors down, and I tried to make that sentence mean something other than what it meant. Since August. 2 months. My mother had called me in September to confirm that I should come in October. She had said, "The room is ready. I put fresh sheets on." She had said, "I bought Noah those little yogurt cups he likes." She had said all of those things, and all of that time, her apartment had been occupied by a stranger. Lily looked up at me and said, "Mommy, is this Grandma's house?" I said, "Yes, baby, just wait here a moment." I stepped back from the door and I called my mother. The phone rang 4 times, which was 2 more times than it usually rang before she picked up. And when she answered, her voice was exactly as I described it, flat, prepared, waiting. She said, "Emma." Just my name, the way you say a name when you've been rehearsing the conversation. I said, "Mom, there is a stranger in your apartment." And she said, "I know." And the floor of the corridor, which was perfectly solid, perfectly real, suddenly felt like it was made of something less reliable than it had been a moment before. She did not explain, not on the phone. She said she would explain when she saw me. She said she was staying at a friend's, a woman named Patrice, someone I had met once or twice over the years, sensible, a retired school teacher. She gave me an address. She told me to come. Her voice throughout all of this was steady in a way that I could not read. It might have been the steadiness of someone managing guilt, or it might have been the steadiness of someone who had been managed. I did not yet know which one it was. That distinction, I would come to understand, was everything. I put the children back in the car. I did not cry. I was too disoriented to cry, too busy cycling through possible explanations with the rapid, slightly frantic efficiency of a person trying to prevent themselves from catastrophizing before they have the facts. Maybe my mother had sublet the apartment without telling me. Careless, hurtful, but explainable. Maybe there had been a maintenance emergency, water damage, something that had temporarily displaced her and she had forgotten to call in the chaos. Maybe she had forgotten. My mother was 63, sharp and present and not remotely confused as a general rule. But people had off months, didn't they? People dropped threads. I was looking, I realize now, for the most benign explanation that would still allow me to be angry at my mother while also not requiring me to confront the alternative, that something more deliberate was in play. I drove 20 minutes to Patrice's building. Patrice let us in with a careful smile and took the children to the kitchen, ostensibly for milk and crackers, which was kind of her. My mother was in the living room, sitting in an armchair, wearing a cardigan I recognized, cream-colored cashmere, a birthday gift from me 2 years ago. And she looked tired in the way I had never quite seen her look before. Not physically tired, morally tired, the tiredness of someone who has been carrying a decision for a long time. I sat down on the sofa across from her. The apartment smelled of Patrice's particular brand of tea, something floral and faintly medicinal, and the lamplight was warm and soft and entirely at odds with what I was feeling, which was cold and very still and waiting. I said, "Tell me." And my mother looked at her own hands for a moment, and then she looked at me and she said, "Your brother came to see me in July." My brother. His name was Marcus. He was 38, 7 years older than me, and I had not spoken to him in over 2 years, not since a phone call that had ended with him telling me, among other things, that I had always been the favored child, and that everything good that had ever happened to our family had happened because of him, and his contributions, and his sacrifices, and that one day I would understand that. I had put down the phone and thought, I hope I never understand that. And for 2 years, I had not had to. Marcus had come to see my mother in July. He had come with his wife, Diane, and with a folder of papers. And what he had proposed, what he had laid out on my mother's kitchen table, the same table where I had done homework for 18 years, the same table where we had eaten every Christmas dinner I could remember, was a solution to a problem I had not known existed. My mother had, it turned out, been struggling financially for considerably longer than she had let on to me. The pension from her years as a school administrator was smaller than it had once been. There had been some adjustment, some reclassification, the details of which she had never shared because she had never wanted to worry me. She had been drawing down savings, slowly and then more quickly, for approximately 3 years. The apartment was paid off, yes, but there were bills, there were medical costs, there were the ordinary and relentless expenses of being a 63-year-old woman living alone in a city where the cost of being alive increased every year. She had not told me. I want to be precise about this because it matters. She had not told me. She had called me every Sunday and asked about the children and listened to me talk about the divorce and the house sale and my own exhaustion, and she had never once said, "Emma, I'm worried about money." Marcus had known. I didn't ask him how that first evening at Patrice's. I was still assembling the picture, still trying to understand the shape of it. But he had known, and he had come with Diane and a folder of papers and a plan. The plan, as my mother explained it to me that evening in the lamplight with her hands folded in her lap, was this. Marcus would arrange a tenant for the apartment. The rental income would cover my mother's monthly shortfall and then some. My mother would move into the spare room at Marcus and Diane's house, temporarily, she stressed, just temporarily, until things stabilized, and the apartment would generate income that would allow her to rebuild her savings and eventually return. It was, described like that, reasonable. I kept waiting for the part where it became unreasonable. And then my mother said, "He had me sign some papers." And the cold stillness inside me became something else, something with an edge to it. I said, "What kind of papers?" She said she hadn't looked at them carefully, that Marcus had explained them and they had seemed straightforward, that she had trusted him because he was her son, and he had presented the whole thing as a gift, as protection, as the responsible path forward. She said he had been very calm about it, very organized, the way Marcus always was. Marcus, who had been the responsible one, the meticulous one, the one who kept records and filed things and arrived early and left late, and never, not once in his entire adult life, did anything without a reason. I asked, "Do you still have copies?" She said she thought there were copies at the apartment, in a drawer in her bedroom. Marcus had said he would keep the originals. He had said the copies were for her records. I sat in Patrice's lamplight, and I looked at my mother, and I tried to find, somewhere in her careful, tired face, the explanation for why she had not called me, why she had let me drive 4 hours with my 2 children and 3 suitcases toward an apartment that had been occupied by a stranger since August, why she had confirmed in September that the room was ready and the yogurt cups were in the fridge and said, "Please do come," and not mentioned any of this. And my mother, who had raised me to be honest the way some people are raised to be religious, as a fundamental, unquestioned practice of daily life, looked at me and said, "He told me not to tell you yet. He said he wanted to explain it to you himself. He said you were going through enough." That was the moment. Not the stranger in the bathrobe, not the unfamiliar furniture, not even the papers. It was that sentence. He said you were going through enough. Because I recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a technique when you finally understand what it is. The performance of protectiveness that is, in fact, the performance of control. Marcus hadn't wanted to protect me from distressing news. Marcus had wanted to control the moment when I found out. He had wanted to manage my reaction. He had wanted to be in the room, or more precisely, he had wanted me not to be able to react until he had already shaped the context around me. I said, very quietly, "Where are Marcus and Diane now?" My mother said they were at home. Their house was 40 minutes away. I said, "Call him. Tell him I'm here." My mother looked at me with that particular maternal attentiveness, the look that knows your tone before you can explain it, and she said, "Emma, don't." I said, "Call him, Mom." And she called him. He arrived an hour later. I had put the children to bed in Patrice's guest room. Lily curled around Noah in the way she always slept when they shared a bed, and I had washed my face and drunk a glass of water and sat at Patrice's kitchen table and thought very carefully about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. Patrice, who was a woman of considerable wisdom and even more considerable discretion, had made another pot of tea and then found a reason to be in another room. Marcus came in looking exactly the way Marcus always looked, organized, prepared, slightly ahead of whatever situation he was entering. He was tall, like our father had been, with the same careful way of moving through a room, deliberate, economical, as if he had already accounted for all possible outcomes and was simply executing the most efficient path between them. Diane was with him, which I had not expected. She was a small, quiet woman who had always struck me as someone who chose her battles with surgical precision. She almost never spoke at family gatherings unless she had something specific to contribute, and what she contributed was almost always, in retrospect, more pointed than it had first appeared. She sat down next to Marcus at the table. They sat across from me like a presentation. Marcus said, "Emma, I'm glad you're here. I was going to call you this week to explain everything." I said, "I drove 4 hours today, Marcus, with Lily and Noah. I knocked on Mom's door and a stranger answered it." He nodded as if this were a reasonable and expected piece of information. He said, "I know. I'm sorry about the timing. Things moved faster than I anticipated with the tenant." That word, anticipated, did something to me. Not the word itself, but the precision of it. Things had moved faster than he had anticipated. He had been anticipating. He had been running projections. I said, "Show me the papers." He looked at me steadily and said, "Of course." He reached into his jacket, not a folder this time, but an actual leather portfolio, the kind that closes with a magnetic clasp, and he laid 3 documents on the table. The first was a property management agreement signed by my mother, giving Marcus the authority to lease the apartment on her behalf. The second was the lease itself, a 12-month agreement with the woman in the bathrobe. Her name was Renata Vasile, and she was paying $1,400 a month, a fair market rate. The third document was the one that made me go very still. It was a power of attorney, general, broad, covering financial decisions, property transactions, legal representation. It had been signed by my mother on the 15th of July, notarized by a notary whose office, I would later discover, was 3 floors below Marcus's workplace. It had been signed the same day he had first come to her apartment with the folder. I looked at my mother. She was sitting at the end of the table, her hands wrapped around her mug of tea, looking at the document as if she were reading it for the first time. Perhaps she was. Perhaps, in July, in the warmth of Marcus's careful explanations, the document had been just paper, just a formality, just the responsible administrative step that her responsible, meticulous son had said it was. I said, "Mom, do you understand what this says?" She said, "He said it was just so he could manage the rental." Marcus said smoothly, "It is. That's exactly what it is." I said, "No, it isn't." And I looked at Marcus across the table, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. And in the silence, I could hear the particular sound of a plan that has been very carefully constructed, beginning very quietly to be seen. I looked at Marcus across the table, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. And in the silence, I could hear the particular ticking of Patrice's kitchen clock, which was shaped like a sunflower and which seemed, in that moment, obscenely cheerful. The power of attorney lay between us on the table, broad, general, the kind of document that does not say, "manage the rental," the kind that says, "I am now empowered to act in your name in all financial matters, in all legal matters, in all property transactions." The kind I knew because I had been through a divorce and had therefore spent more time than I ever wanted to in the company of legal documents, that gave the holder the ability to sell property, to transfer assets, to sign agreements on someone else's behalf. I said, "Marcus, this document gives you the authority to sell Mom's apartment." He said, still calm, still precise, "It gives me the authority to manage her affairs. That's all I've been doing." I said, "That is not all this says." He reached across the table, not toward the document, but toward me, a conciliatory gesture, palm up, the gesture of a man explaining something to someone who has misunderstood. And he said, "Emma, I know this has been a shock, arriving and finding the apartment occupied. I should have called you, but everything I've done has been for Mom's benefit. She needed help, and I provided it." Diane, beside him, nodded slightly, not emphatically, not theatrically, just a small, confirming tilt of the head that I noticed because I had been watching her. I said, "Has there been any discussion of selling the apartment?" Marcus paused. It was a brief pause, perhaps a second, perhaps less, but it was a pause where there should not have been one. A pause where a man who had never once considered selling his mother's apartment would have said, "Of course not," without any hesitation at all. He said, "There have been conversations about what options might be available to Mom long term." That's responsible planning. My mother, at the end of the table, made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath. And I looked at her, and she was looking at her hands again. I said, "Mom, has Marcus talked to you about selling the apartment?" She said, very quietly, "He mentioned that eventually it might make more sense to—" Marcus said, "Mom, we don't need to get into—" I said, "Let her finish." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Patrice's sunflower clock ticked. Outside, a car passed in the street. My mother looked at her hands, and then she looked up, and she looked at Marcus, and something shifted in her expression, something that had been held tightly for a long time, releasing, not with drama, not with tears, but with the quiet finality of a decision made. She said, "He mentioned that if the apartment were sold, the proceeds could be invested, and between the investment income and moving in with him and Diane, I would never have to worry about money again." She said, "He said it would be the sensible thing." She said, "He said you would understand eventually." That phrase again, "you would understand eventually." The phrase that means we have already decided and your understanding is not required, only your eventual acceptance. I picked up the power of attorney from the table. I held it and I read it, the whole thing, slowly, every clause, while Marcus watched me with the particular stillness of someone who is very confident in the structure they have built, but is beginning incrementally to be less confident than they were 10 minutes ago. The document was dated July 15th. It had been notarized. It was, on its face, valid. And in the hands of a man who had already demonstrated that he was capable of moving a tenant into his mother's apartment without informing her daughter, a man who spoke of selling family property as sensible long-term planning, a man who had advised my mother not to tell me anything until he was ready to control the narrative. In those hands, this document was not a management tool. It was a key, and he had been holding it since July. I set the document down. I looked at Marcus, and I said, I'm going to need you to explain to me exactly what conversations you have had with any real estate agent, any lawyer, or any buyer regarding this apartment. I'm going to need those answers tonight, and I'm going to need them to be true. He said, with the first hint of something other than calm in his voice, something faintly defensive, faintly irritated, the tone of a man who has been challenged by someone he had not expected to challenge him. Emma, I think you're overreacting. I said, I drove 4 hours today with my children to an apartment full of strangers. My mother signed a general power of attorney that she doesn't fully understand on the same day you presented it to her. You told her not to tell me. I'm not overreacting, Marcus. I'm paying attention. He left an hour later with Diane, and the drive home was 40 minutes, and I imagined it taking place in a particular quality of silence. My mother and I sat in Patrice's kitchen after they were gone, and Patrice refilled the tea without being asked, and my mother said, I didn't think it would be like this. I said, I know. She said, he made it seem so straightforward. I said, that's what he's good at. She said, Emma, I'm sorry I didn't tell you. And I said, I know, Mom. And I meant it. I understood why she hadn't told me. I understood the shame of financial difficulty in a woman of her generation, and I understood the relief of having a solution offered by someone who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. I was not angry at her. I was angry at the architecture, at the structure Marcus had built so carefully around her, with her good faith as the foundation. That night, I slept in Patrice's spare room on a narrow bed beside Lily and Noah, Lily's arm thrown over Noah's shoulder, both of them breathing with the deep, uncomplicated rhythm of children who have not yet learned to stay awake worrying. I lay beside them in the dark, and I thought about the power of attorney, and about what it enabled, and about the tenant in my mother's apartment, and about the phrase sensible long-term planning. And somewhere around 2 a.m, I made a decision. Not an angry decision, not a reactive one. A cold, deliberate, entirely clear decision. I was going to understand exactly what had been done, and I was going to undo it. In the morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Susan Park, and I had been referred to her during my divorce by a colleague who had described her as very thorough and completely without sentiment, which were exactly the qualities I needed. I explained the situation in broad strokes. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Does your mother want to revoke the power of attorney? I said I believed she did. Susan said, Then that's where we start. Bring me the copy of the document and any other paperwork your mother has from your brother's visit. I said I would. She said, And Ms., I want you to understand something. If any real estate transactions have been initiated under this document without your mother's full and current informed consent, that is not a family dispute. That is a legal matter. I said, I understand. She said, Good. I drove to my mother's building that morning. Renata Vasili, who was in the kitchen when I knocked, turned out to be a perfectly reasonable woman who had rented the apartment through an agency, had paid her deposit, had signed her lease in good faith, and had been told nothing about the owner's family situation. She was not part of anything. She was simply a woman who had rented an apartment, and her presence in it was not a crime. It was a consequence. I explained that there might be a legal review of the lease arrangement, and that I was not asking her to leave, only asking whether she would consent to me reviewing the original lease agreement. She said she had nothing to hide and showed me her copy. The agency named on the lease was one I didn't recognize, but the commission recipient, the individual who had arranged the rental and received the finder's fee, was listed as M. Harrow, which was Marcus's wife's maiden name. I stood in the kitchen of my mother's apartment in the smell of someone else's garlic and someone else's herbs, and I took a photograph of that line with my phone. M. Harrow. Diane had collected a fee from the placement of a tenant in her mother-in-law's apartment. the apartment that Marcus now had the legal authority to sell, the apartment that generated monthly income that, I checked that evening when I sat with my mother and went through every document she had, was being deposited not into my mother's account, but into a joint account that Marcus had opened in both their names in August, 3 weeks after the power of attorney was signed. My mother had not known about the joint account. She had believed the rental income was going somewhere on her behalf, building toward her stability, exactly as Marcus had described. She had not received a statement. She had not been given a debit card. She had been given instead an allowance, $500 a month in cash, which Marcus brought when he visited, which he presented as her share of the income, which was, I calculated when I saw the lease amount, approximately 1/3 of what was actually being deposited. I sat at Patrice's kitchen table that evening with all of the documents laid out in front of me, and I counted. The tenant had been in the apartment since August. 3 months of rent at $1,400, $4,200, minus the $500 per month Marcus had been giving my mother, $1,500. Marcus and Diane had collected over 3 months $2,700 from my mother's property, and they had done it legally, or nearly legally, or in the gray zone between legality and something else, because they had a document with my mother's signature on it, obtained on the same day it was presented to her by her son, whom she trusted, in her own kitchen, at her own table. I called Susan Park back that evening. I told her what I had found. There was a pause, and then she said, "Send me photographs of everything." I did. She called me back 20 minutes later and said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. The revocation of the power of attorney was the first step, and it was the simplest. My mother signed a revocation document in Susan's office 2 days later, with Susan as witness, and copies were sent by registered mail to Marcus, to the notary who had witnessed the original, and to the agency that had placed the tenant. Marcus received his copy on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, he had called my mother 4 times and me twice. I did not answer. My mother, following Susan's advice, did not answer either. He left messages. The first 2 were measured and managerial. "We should discuss this, Mom. There's no need for lawyers. This is a family matter." The third was less measured. The fourth was the kind of message that a person leaves when they have realized that the structure they spent months building is beginning to be dismantled, and the dismantling is being done by people who are not going to stop. 2 weeks later, Susan filed a formal complaint with the State Financial Oversight Board regarding the undisclosed commission collected by Diane under her maiden name, and a civil claim for the return of the rental income that had been withheld from my mother over 3 months. Marcus responded through his own lawyer, which was both predictable and, in its way, clarifying. A man who responds to a family financial dispute by immediately lawyering up is a man who understands that what he did was not, strictly speaking, a gift. The civil claim was settled 4 months later. Marcus and Diane returned the withheld rental income in full and paid an additional sum in legal costs. The joint account was closed. The power of attorney was gone. The lease with Renata Vasile continued because my mother decided, and it was her decision, made clearly and without pressure from anyone, that the rental income, properly managed and deposited into her own account, was actually a useful thing. She moved back into the apartment 6 months after I arrived at the door to find a stranger in a bathrobe. Renata had found a new place by then, cordially, with adequate notice, and had left the apartment cleaner than she'd found it. Marcus and I did not speak for a long time after the settlement. When we finally did, a careful, formal phone call, the kind that takes place between people who were once close and are now managing a perimeter, he said that he had believed he was helping. I said I was sure some part of him had. I said that the part of him that had opened a joint account without telling her and directed rental income into it and paid her an allowance instead and collected a commission through Diane's maiden name, I said that part of him had known exactly what it was doing. He didn't argue with that. The silence on the line was the silence of a man who has been seen clearly and has decided that denying it is no longer worth the effort. My mother called me that evening after the phone call with Marcus, and she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Tired, but okay." She said, "I should have called you in July." I said, "Yes." She said, "I was ashamed." I said, "I know, Mom, but you should have called me." She said, "I know." And that was, somehow, enough. I found an apartment that autumn, 20 minutes from Lily's school and 8 minutes from Noah's clinic, on the 3rd floor of a building with a small balcony that caught the afternoon light. It was not as large as I had imagined, and the deposit took most of what I had, and the first few months were tight in the way that first months always are. But the kitchen had a window above the sink that looked out over a courtyard with a maple tree, and in the mornings, when the children were still asleep, I stood at that window with my coffee and watched the light come through the branches, and I thought about the drive 4 hours ago with 3 suitcases and a box of Lily's books, and the absolute certainty that the worst thing that had happened to me was my divorce. I had been wrong about that, but I had also been wrong about something else. I had thought for a long time that the worst moments were the ones that broke you. I understood now that they were the ones that showed you what you were made of, which is a different thing entirely. Lily and Noah still visited their grandmother every Sunday. My mother fed them from the same table where Marcus had spread his papers, the same table where I had done homework for 18 years, and she called it our table now, in a way she had never quite called it before, as if reclaiming it required saying it aloud. The Klimt print was back on the wall. The apartment smelled of Chanel No. 5 and beeswax candles. The pigeons on the balcony were fed on Sunday mornings, and she called it meditation. Some things, once broken, do not fully return to what they were. That is not the same as not being whole.